Okay, we'll do this again. Howdy, everyone, and welcome.
Howdy.
Welcome to TAMU-SPE Executive Series for the spring semester. Today, we are very delighted and honored to have the President and the CEO of CNX Resources, Mr. Nick Deiuliis. He made it from the north to here just to talk to you and share his insight, experience about the oil and gas industry, especially natural gas, and hopefully give you some advice and talk more about the opportunities they have at CNX. So we are very excited for this, and hopefully you will get to know more about CNX and the operations that they do. And now, before we start, let me introduce Nick. Nick Deiuliis is the President and the Chief Executive Officer of CNX Resources Corporation. He's an attorney, engineer, podcaster, and author. He wrote the acclaimed novel Precipice, the left's campaign to destroy America, and he's also the host of the Far Middle podcast. He is a regular media contributor and speaks extensively on the virtues of carbon economy, the nobility of middle class, and also the importance of individuals' rights. Nick earned his MBA and JD degree from Duquesne University and his bachelor degree in chemical engineering from Penn State University. And now, without any further ado, we'll start the conversation. Thank you, Nick, for joining us. It's a great pleasure.
Thanks for having me, everybody.
So we'll start off with some questions about your education. As Qasim mentioned, you have degrees in chemical engineering, business, and law. Can you tell us more about those degrees and what inspired you to get a unique variety of educational endeavors?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, Teresa, I could sit here and say that I planned all of that, but that wouldn't be truthful. So a lot of this, and we'll maybe talk about this as different questions and issues pop up. A lot of this is sort of the planning phase of careers and then the randomness side of things. I like chemistry, I like science, math. I didn't know what a chemical engineer was or what a chemical engineer did, but off I went to college. And over those 4 years, coming out with a degree, I still didn't have a good feel for what a chemical engineer was or what a chemical engineer did. But I can tell you, looking back on those three very different journeys, very different, all three of them, for business, law, engineering, I can honestly say definitively that if you can sort of exert the discipline and the process and the rigor that goes with what it takes to become an engineer, petroleum engineer, engineer of any type of training. There is nothing in terms of other skill sets, disciplines, degrees, et cetera, that you could not achieve using that same sort of recipe. There are different ways of thinking that you will need to learn. That was sort of part of the fun of it. How an attorney thinks is very different from a process perspective than how we engineers think. But if you can master the process of becoming an engineer, and the discipline and rigor that goes with it. Whether you want to pursue something in business, whether you want to pursue something with regard to the law, if you want to do something with regard to writing or creating, that wherewithal will exist. So for me, looking back, if you ask me today, what am I would say first and foremost, I'm an engineer, and I always will be.
That's good to hear, especially since a lot of us here are mostly petroleum engineers with some like geologists and such. But last question on your education. Could you comment on how your education prepared you for this career in upper level leadership that you're in now?
Well, the variety of those different ways of thinking and ways of approaching things across business versus engineering versus the law, certainly that spectrum has helped quite a bit. Because when you look at what goes on in the energy space today, in the industry that you're all going to be part of and you're currently part of, it's fast moving. It has many different facets. You heard some of that in the video with respect to environment, with respect to efficiencies and rate of returns, with respect to well productivity, the science behind what we're doing, with respect to market development increasingly. And frankly, with regard to advocacy and even everything as large as geopolitics. So it's all encompassing with respect to the energy industry. It's rapidly changing and evolving, and having the ability to be as multifaceted as you can, that's a huge advantage. But underneath all that is that foundation and that core of your fundamental sort of STEM, engineering, science, training, and discipline.
All right, thank you. Now let's move to your experience and early career. The first question, what sparked your motivation to the energy sector?
Yeah, well, again, sort of in hindsight, young professional about to enter the workforce coming out of college, My family, I was the first in my family to go to college. I was a lifelong Pittsburgher, lived in the Pittsburgh area. My number one priority at that point in time was finding a career path that would allow me to stay somewhere in that Western Pennsylvania neck of the woods. Now, Teresa, with you spending some time in that area, you're thinking, why would you ever want to do that, right? But that was home for me. That's where my family was. That's where my family's history was. That's where everything that I knew existed. And thinking through that as a chemical engineer, I was looking at your typical chemical companies like a PPG, Alcoa, those types of entities that were in Western Pennsylvania. But I sort of stumbled upon this opportunity at the time for a predecessor company that's become CNX Resources almost by happenstance, by accident. And I interviewed for the position, and they were looking for a chemical engineer to basically perform heat material balances on power plants, which were utilizing different fuels, and figuring out how would different fuels behave with regard to heat rate and different sort of aspects of the boiler and power plant performance, and how would that impact the economics on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis. And I got to know sort of the end use of what we produce in the energy space with respect to natural gas and power generation very well. So again, it was one of those things where I didn't have a specific plan in mind to get into the energy industry, but when you couple the training and the education with the desire to stay in a certain region and sort of that foundation of energy that it plays in Western Pennsylvania and in Appalachia that you heard in the video, that's how those things came together. What's coming up on, believe it or not, 33 years ago. And that sounds like an awfully long time to everybody in this room, but I promise you, you will be sitting up in a place like this one day, maybe virtually, 33 years down the road, and you'll be saying, I can't believe that I'm sitting here talking to individuals where I've been working at a company or in an industry longer than maybe everybody in here has been alive. It'll happen.
All right, that's great to hear. Talking about CNX, in 1990, you joined CNX Resources and assumed a variety of engineering and leadership roles. Could you please tell us more about some of these roles?
So my first set of roles that I had as an entry-level engineer was to, again, spend a lot of time with respect to field operations when it came to power plants and power generation, and understanding every little nuance of how different power plants are designed, how they perform, how they behave under different conditions, as well as different fuels, and then tying that, and this is an important point, tying all of that back to the underlying economics, the underlying key economic financial metric that basically determined the performance of that giant asset. And for a power plant, that's a dollar per kilowatt hour, dollar per megawatt hour metric. What basically made it lower, what made it more efficient. And that, to me, at that point in time, early in a career, sort of made the point that at the end of the day, engineering, science, STEM is about finding ways to fundamentally set up processes or make decisions that have a rate of return or a value proposition on the back end of this. And linking and understanding that linkage is crucial. And to the extent that you can find ways to close that gap and make it a seamless assessment or analysis to see the bigger picture, that's another tremendous advantage with respect to career development, especially in places like energy.
Okay, perfect. You are talking about career development and CNX. So is there a particular moment or a person at CNX that helped you to elevate like your career trajectory or your ambition about the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, so people that have played, or a person that's played an outsized role, I think what I found, and I suspect that many of you will find this as well, you're going to have that key individual at different key roles and different key individuals at different points in your career. So who that was, the first year out as a entry-level engineer, yeah, there was that person, and they made just a material impact on me and giving me the confidence, if nothing else, to sort of learn, develop, gain that confidence, expand horizons. But 5 years after that, it was a completely different individual in a completely different setting. So these things will change and evolve over time. And being open to those types of career opportunities and being open to developing those new relationships, right, within the company you're working for, beyond the company that you're working for with colleagues and other types of networking, that really sort of statistically, right, when you think about it in the form of statistics, opens up the opportunity to find that person quicker and make that connection more seamless.
In short, it seems like you're really summarizing the importance of networking, which is super important. So I hope everyone stays around after to network with Mr. Deiuliis. So moving now into your mid-career, in 2005, you were appointed as the president and CEO of CNX Gas Corporation. In 2014, you became the CEO and director of CNX Resources. How would you describe CNX's culture in terms of leadership and teamwork dynamics?
So this is the culture question, right? There's always this discussion and debate about culture and the importance of culture, and it is absolutely crucial. But what is it? You know, what is the essence of a culture within a team, within a company, or within an industry? Well, for us, we have three key values, and our values are responsibility, ownership, and excellence. And I can tell you that we spent a lot of time figuring out how we're going to define each of those three. A lot of wordsmithing, a lot of thinking through, well, change that word in the definition of excellence and add this word in the definition of responsibility or ownership. But in the end, what we quickly realized is that culture, if those three values define our culture at CNX, we will know it when we see it. So we can define it, we can wordsmith it, we can put it on a website, we can talk about it in a presentation, but the way that you'll see it is filtering literally every decision that the individual makes and that the company or the team makes through those three values. And if you are seeing decisions in a company or on a team that are inconsistent with the stated values, that's a problem. And that is unfortunately fairly common. It's probably more common than seeing situations where the decision-making is consistent with the values. That might be more of the exception. I'm happy to say, right, through the years, we've reached that point where the decision-making is consistent and filters through consistently with the values. Now that means, if you're being consistent with that, there will be tough decisions that you make, but they will be consistent decisions. And they really, looking back on that specific decision, if you post-audit as a group or as a team, it's not going to come as a big shock in hindsight.
All right, perfect. Since we started talking about CNX, the values and the vision, for more than 150 years, CNX has been at the forefront of the Appalachian petroleum production and economic evaluation. Could you please tell us more about the motivation, the vision, and also the foundation of CNX?
Yeah, well, I mean, it starts with this having an impact, having a societal impact. If you want to be motivated with respect to career and with respect to performing within a team, you obviously want to do that with a group or in an industry or with a company that makes a material, impactful difference to society. You can't get more impactful than energy. Everything downstream of it hinges on it. So think of the impact of a doctor, right? Think of the impact of healthcare. That all hinges upon the energy industry doing what we do. If we stop, that stops. So it's so fundamental to societies. It's so fundamental to quality of life. And that applies across the planet, from the developing world to the West and to everything in between. And that, to me, has always been a big motivation. That's a big motivation for each and every one of our employees. You saw that again in the video. But that makes a huge difference. That makes it easier to really commit to what are the values going to be. Are we going to make sure our decisions are consistent with the values, that culture thing, right? And it also makes for a great development tool, retention tool, motivating tool. It sets, everything sort of flows from that. So to me, it's really the societal impact that energy has, and specifically pieces of the energy sector like natural gas.
All right, perfect. So let's move to the employment opportunities. So we are still at CNX. So what opportunities do you have, for example, for students who are pursuing their degree in petroleum engineering, chemical engineering, in terms of internships or full-time jobs, if they are interested to go to the north?
Well, it sounds like Game of Thrones. We're going to head to the north, right? But yeah, I hope you would be interested. And we do have, a whole suite of different opportunities that would start predominantly in the skill sets of petroleum engineering or of geology or of the different STEM disciplines, where it's more akin to what you would expect based on what you've studied or what you've been working on the past 4 years. But then I can tell you that if the career is a success within a company like ours, with sort of the values and the opportunity set that we just described, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, you will be doing very different types of jobs, have very different types of functions, and having different types of impacts than when you originally started. So like I said, I've been there now at the company for 33 years. I've never worked anywhere else professionally, but I can tell you it feels as if I've had, over those 33 years or coming up on 33 years, 12 different jobs. And that is just tied to, it correlates to the nature of the rate of change, the opportunity set within energy and within places like Appalachia, right? Or on top of that, with respect to companies that have sort of the values or the culture of CNX. So in some ways, it's sort of interesting to see that, and maybe at first blush, wow, how did that happen? But when you think it through, again, it sort of makes sense.
Okay, perfect. That's interesting. How about CNX tackling with topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of like opportunities or daily activities? Could you please tell us more about this?
Yeah, so diversity and inclusion, D&I, that's another topic like culture that everybody is focused on, everybody talks about. Couple of thoughts. First thing, I strongly believe that the most important type of diversity is diversity of thought and diversity of background. That is how like really great teams are constructed. That's how high-performing teams are constructed. Now, I will look at my sort of team of the C-suite with the executives that we've got at CNX. It's a very diverse team. We've got gender diversity, we've got racial diversity, we've got all kinds of different types of physical diversity that people typically equate that to. I will also tell you that every single one of those individuals on the team, they got there through 100% merit. We are a big believer in meritocracy. So if you embrace diversity of thought and diversity of background coupled with a meritocracy, it's going to look a lot like this room. Okay? That's the way it's, so they are consistent. And I think all too often, people, whether it's conscious or subconsciously, they almost view them as different things. And I think that's a bad approach. And again, it's not an approach that's consistent with our values of ownership, responsibility, and excellence. So we've managed, I think, to be a case where if you do embrace diversity of background, diversity of thought, and you couple it with a meritocracy, you will inevitably come up with a diverse and inclusive team. They go hand in hand.
Yeah, our TAMU-SPE student chapter here, we have our own D&I committee, and we just had a panel last week where other people from industry, preach that same message. So it's awesome to hear an executive like yourself from the North, has a synchronized message there. So we'll now move into the natural gas sector in the U.S. and the world. So what are your thoughts on the current state and the challenges of the U.S. natural gas industry, and where does natural gas play a role in the energy transition?
Yeah, well, a couple of big thoughts there. Sometimes you'll hear that natural gas is a bridge fuel, right, to some other sort of energy mix over the longer term. Disagree with that view. I think natural gas is fundamentally a catalyst fuel. I don't think the natural gas industry or the demand for natural gas is going anywhere other than up. There's a lot of different reasons for that, but it goes back to the fundamental science and engineering behind what the life cycle carbon intensity is of natural gas, what the underlying economics are of it, what it means with respect to affordability and how it can drive those downstream segments of our economy that we talked about, such as healthcare. So that's one thought. It's a catalyst fuel. It's not a bridge fuel. Natural gas has a very, very bright future. Second thought sort of ties back. So there's a big misunderstanding of that, right? And this gets back to science and engineering and physics and math. And what I mean by that is if you think of something like carbon footprint, what really matters for different energy sources is a life cycle carbon footprint, carbon intensity, not just, scope 3 or scope 1 or scope 1 and 2, all the scopes. Because from an atmospheric perspective, doesn't matter where the CO2 is being emitted with regard to the supply chain or the manufacturing process for a form of energy. CO2 emission is CO2 emission. So when you look at the life cycle carbon intensity of solar, and you compare that on an apples-to-apples basis using sound engineering judgment to that of natural gas power generation, natural gas's life cycle CO2 emissions, carbon intensity, stacks up very well, in fact, quite well relative to solar. But we've been, the mantra has been that solar is zero. No, far from it. Wind is not zero when it comes to life cycle CO2 intensity. And this gets back to, I was earlier today at the hotel across from the stadium. And there's that big saying, it's the Aggie adage in stone there. And it says something along the lines of, when you're looking at it from the outside looking in, you can't understand it. And from the inside looking out, you can't explain it. No offense to the Aggie adage, okay? But for us, for you, future leaders in the energy industry, you from the inside, you have to be able to explain it, okay? Because people on the outside, they have to start to understand it. They don't understand it right now. And we have had a huge challenge explaining it. And that sort of discourse has been lacking, which means, the views, the established accepted truths have been set with, they're inconsistent with engineering, science, and math. Those, math is undefeated over the time that, that as long as humans have been walking the earth. So we got to get back to, the engineering, the science, the physics of what's going on, which are pretty fundamental. And then as advocates, as engineers, as geologists, as advocates, we've got to message that in the proper manner.
Yeah, I think CNX does a great job of that through the Appalachia First white page document that you guys have on your website that I encourage everyone to check out, and then as well as your podcast and your book as well. So you talked about, the life cycle of carbon intensity and affordability. How can we achieve a balance of energy security and sustainability?
Yeah, so sustainability is an interesting one, and I know you guys spend a lot of time, right, studying that, incorporating that within all the different curriculum, coursework, job opportunities, internships. Sustainability is one of those things like culture that everybody defines it, and the UN definition is the most popular definition. But if you read the UN's definition of sustainability, it sounds awesome, and then you think about it, and you're like, well, what does it really say? It doesn't really say anything. Okay, it really doesn't give you any roadmap, recipe to basically filtering or deciding what to do. Do you go left? Do you go right on an issue when it comes to maximizing sustainability? So again, I think we go back to the core fundamentals. And the core fundamentals are going to be, reliability of energy, the affordability of energy, the life cycle carbon intensity of energy, and then more now bigger issues surrounding things like the social impacts of energy. Okay, I can tell you that just thinking of the natural gas industry, you guys are all familiar with what your job prospects are going to be shortly, right? You know what you can expect with regard to all-in compensation. It's very attractive. So all this torture that you're going through for the next 4 years is going to pay off, right? There's a reason why you're doing that. Compare that to what a child in Africa is being paid to mine in dangerous conditions in cobalt mines for wind and solar. Compare that to what is going on in Xinjiang with regard to Uyghurs in China with regard to Muslim minority oppression. These are the realities of what goes on with regard to certain supply chains and energy that get completely ignored. And those things are very important. Okay, so there's like a CO2 reckoning for supply chain links along these development chains, and there's a human aspect. And then there's a geopolitical aspect, okay? Energy and domestic energy can be an enabler for individual rights all across this planet. And that's really important. It could be Russia, Ukraine, right? It could be Japan, China, Taiwan, China. It could be a whole bunch of different sort of potential flare-up areas across the planet. And what's that value with respect to, supporting individual rights, Western Republican democracies, those types of things? It's very, very tangible. So this gets back to the fundamentals, and I think we've got a great story situation with domestic energy. We just need to be in a position to start advocating and telling that story.
Yeah, and I think, telling the story is up to all of us in here, not just yourself. Moving on to the next question, could you comment on the state of the liquefied natural gas market and what challenges and opportunities does CNX have in that market?
Yeah, so another big area in the natural gas space, as you all know, is LNG, liquefied natural gas, exporting that. Wasn't that long ago we were all planning to import that in the United States because we didn't feel we had any way to produce or sustain the supply of natural gas that we were producing at the time. Shows you how often the experts can be wrong about things, right? But looking at things, again, logically from an engineering perspective, our view, and this gets into the Appalachia First vision that you mentioned, our view that the more immediate opportunity, logical opportunity for the natural gas industry in places like Appalachia is instead of exporting it via LNG across the globe, it's instead to use it to vertically integrate and displace sort of foreign-sourced gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel. In other words, vertically integrated into transportation fuels. And if you think about that, and you look at regions like Appalachia, what you're doing is you would be taking what is currently a supply chain that stretches tens of thousands of miles cumulatively, okay, coming from certain troubling areas of the planet, has a very intensive CO2 footprint across that supply chain, has a dollar per million BTU cost tied to it on a delivered basis, has a CO2 footprint and a other emission, pollutant emission footprint. And you're going to replace that with domestic, right, manufactured energy, much lower CO2 footprint. Instead of thousands of miles of supply chain, dozens of miles, right? Instead of foreign sourced, domestically sourced, lower CO2, lower particulate diesel, and on a dollar per million BTU basis, a fraction of what diesel is on an equivalent basis. So there's a massive economic, environmental, and social, right, aspect to this that just is screaming for technology within the energy space to take that next incremental step, and it's just an incremental step of innovation, to start to provide substitute fuels for transportation, whether it's air to ground, fleet to individual. And we think that's the next best opportunity. LNG will have a time and a place, but that's after this. This is the more, again, from a engineering perspective and an economic perspective, the more logical immediate opportunity is vertical integration into transportation. Once we tackle that, which by the way, if you do that, that then opens up what would have been coming here to be fuel sources for more logical other places, shorter supply chain places in the world. So, everybody will benefit on a cumulative net basis. But first things first, we're more focused on a couple of steps of technology development to get natural gas to be efficiently manufactured into CNG and LNG on the pad, at the wellhead, and then to use that CNG or LNG to displace transportation markets.
All right, perfect. So since you started talking about Appalachia first, which is like the vision that you have, and you previously talked to me about some current projects related to energy transition and net zero emissions, for example, the CCS project and the hydrogen project. Could you please tell us more about this vision and what's the main difference between like the Appalachia vision compared to like what's happening here in Texas in terms like of the different approaches that companies that are doing in order to reduce emissions and approach like the net zero emission by 2050 or so?
Yeah, so I think the first big sort of underlying concept or principle that we're applying is looking at things across the true life cycle cumulative impact. CO2 footprint, cost, and then sort of societal impacts. Looking at that on that basis consistently then sort of leads you into what makes the most sense that will maximize the metrics that you want to maximize and minimize the ones that you're looking to minimize. And this gets into looking at something like manufactured energy in the Appalachian Basin, considering right how close it is in proximity to the biggest demand centers on the planet, basically. And then finding ways through technology to harness things like potential energy through pressure gradients of things like the Utica Horizon just below the Marcellus, and finding ways to cheaply, efficiently, elegantly manufacture the gaseous methane into CNG or LNG. You start to think about it from that context, and then what CNG and LNG can be used for with respect to applications to displace current pieces of the energy mix. You start to see then, well, the infrastructure in Appalachia, the sort of history of energy production in Appalachia, its location relative to demand centers, its prior history of innovation. This is really nothing new. It's almost in some ways just a redux or a repeat of what Appalachia's been doing for generations. It all starts to click and make sense. You get into different basins across North America, similar type of analysis, right? You apply the same principles and the same judgments and metrics, and you might come up with a little bit of a different mix. Maybe LNG in something like the Haynesville makes more sense because it's closer to LNG terminals, right? There's maybe not as big of an opportunity for some of these other displacement sets that I've talked about. So it's going to be site-specific, but if you apply the same principles and the same judgment, you come away with a conclusion, whether it's Haynesville, Appalachia, Western US, Rockies, it doesn't matter. The future of the natural gas industry, the future of the domestic energy industry, you have to be extremely bullish on it.
All right, that's great to hear. Talking about the future, so I think like the sequence of questions is following as like the perfect way. So most of us here are petroleum engineers, geologists, or chemical engineers who are looking forward to join the industry. But most of the times we are worried about the future of the oil and gas industry or the energy industry. So could you please tell us like how's the future of oil and gas will be in the next 5 to 10 years from your perspective?
So we're in a very interesting time right now. From a industry perspective, it's always been guilty of too much of this, okay? So when gas prices or oil prices go up, everybody just ramps up and tries to grow too quickly. And when gas prices or oil prices moderate, everybody wants to pull back. And it's just this knee-jerk reaction back and forth. That creates a lot of career volatility, a lot of team and efficiency volatility, a lot of messing with cultures, because cultures get tested during those whipsaw areas of the curve. So that's one issue that I think the industry actually has gotten much better at. It's been much more measured. And we've done a tremendous amount of work within our business model to keep a pace. If you look at our pace today versus our pace when gas prices were higher, it's basically the same activity pace. There's another thing going on, though, too. And this is a good news, bad news situation. Outside of the energy industry, all these things that we've been talking about, these policy implications and getting policy right. Right now, we have policy wrong when it comes to energy in the United States and in the EU, okay? Completely wrong, completely backward. That creates symptoms like Ukraine, like Putin. It's enabled Putin. It creates the symptom of in Iran. It creates what could potentially happen with Taiwan. So and it creates inflation, energy inflation and general inflation, right? It hurts economic growth. So there's a reckoning that's coming because it has, again, under the laws of science, if we keep doubling down on these flawed policies, things will break. We're seeing them break. We saw the grid break in California. We saw the grid break in a place called Texas, right? With the reliance on wind. We're seeing in Boston, believe it or not, we cannot build a 400-mile pipeline from Pennsylvania to Boston. Where does Boston get its energy in the dead of winter? It imports LNG from Russia. How is that sustainable? Again, I can't define sustainability, but I know that's not it, okay? So we're going to see more and more of these things. We almost had a PJM grid breakdown in Pennsylvania, Maryland over this winter, right over Christmas Eve when a deep freeze came. At some point, there's going to be a wake up that policy is flawed and we need to reassess everything. When that happens, if you think you've got great career prospects now, wait, because there will be a realization that's coming that this is the most important industry within the United States and probably across the planet. And if you don't have leading skill sets in geology and chemical and petroleum and any form of engineering or STEM you can think of, you're not even going to be able to compete on an even keel basis.
That's very exciting.
Hopefully this wake-up call is closer.
The bad news is I don't know how long that's going to take. It could be next week we figure this all out. Might be 10 years. So we'll see. I hope it's in a week.
Yeah, hopefully it's soon. I agree. So we want to leave time for question and answer, so we'll go now to a couple of closing questions. So you've had a really successful career thus far. A lot of us in this room are graduating soon or are going to have just a couple more years left. So if you could go back to this time in your life when you're just about to graduate college or right around that time, what advice would you give to yourself for our students here today?
Oh, couple of pieces of advice. One, have a plan, but two, expect that plan to go awry the minute you walk out the door. Okay? So it's important, that makes any sense. It's important to plan and to think careers through and to have a plan, but it's also important to recognize it's not going to go according to that plan and adjust the minute you see factors change. That's just the duality of what it's like to be a very talented individual like yourselves in a really sort of interesting, creative career like energy or industry like energy. So sort of planning, but then accepting it's going to be volatile, it's going to be random, adjust as you go. Sort of another idea too that, and again, this is something over time and it depends on the individual. So there's no right or wrong answer to this, but it's the Greeks had a term for it. It was called thumos. And thumos is Thymos. Thumos is sort of the need of a human to be recognized, to achieve, okay? It's drive. And I don't think any of you got to where you are other than you exude an exorbitant amount of thumos. That's what creates achievement, drive, recognition. And there's different ways to find that. And again, different people have different levels of it. It's not a bad thing or a bad person if they don't have, sort of a oversized level of that in their life. But if you do, and I think you all do because you wouldn't be where you're at if you didn't, sitting here at A&M, ready to embark on an awesome career. But recognize that, and when the career opportunities pop up, filter through that. Is this going to give me my opportunity to go achieve, to go attain recognition, to go be accomplished my way, the way that I'm comfortable doing that? And everybody's comfortable different ways. Okay, believe it or not, I'm very much an introvert. Okay, so like my way of trying to go after that's very different than maybe someone else, right? But I've got that drive. And that's the one thing that hasn't changed over 33 years, right? My hair color's changed, and what I'm doing now versus what I did that. But that's the one thing that's been constant. And for us, again, going back to our culture, excellence, ownership, responsibility, that's like a fancy way of basically attributing it to TAMU-SPE. We're looking for people that exude that TAMU-SPE their own special way. And by the way, their own special way, what's that code for? Diversity of thought, diversity of background, right? So like it all ties together.
All right, that's really interesting and exciting. Hopefully this is gonna be your motivation. Most of you have exams this week, so take it as a motivation. Yeah, talking about like the future petroleum engineers or professional engineers, like, do you have any recommendation for any type of skills that the current energy engineers in general need to have? You mentioned like if you want to be in the oil and gas industry and get like a sustainable and a secure job, you need to be equipped with these skills. So what type of skills you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Couple thoughts there. One, your technical skill sets. They're important, but you already have, you would not be where you're at if you didn't have those. Whatever you would need to develop or learn technically, above and beyond what you already have coming out of A&M, you will learn that right on the job. That's going to be wired into your career opportunity. Don't worry about that. Do not worry about your technical prowess. As soon as you show up to your next opportunity, you're going to feel like you're years behind. You will catch up quickly. And your employer, your team is not going to be worried about that. Okay, what they're going to be looking for are two things. That drive. And again, that drive does not mean like you're running people over, right? But that drive is like a willingness to learn, a willingness to adapt, a willingness to achieve, right? And fitting that within whatever the context is of the culture of the team that you're joining. And then the second thing is the ability to communicate. That is like, it's really underrated and it's terribly important, okay? And communication, again, that does not mean you need to get up on a podium and give some sort of like awesome speech, or you need to be able to produce some sort of really slick videos, or you need to be able to write Pulitzer Prize winning. Yeah, exactly, like what we're doing here. It just means that you need to be able to find a way to communicate what you found out of complexity into the takeaway for people who are going to be making decisions alongside you or impacting your career that are not engineers, that are not scientists, that don't understand all the technicalities. They're speaking a different language. Can you bridge that? And if you can bridge that, you become a very valuable commodity.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. One last question, or actually two questions. First of all, what's your top book recommendation for us? And the second one is, what has been the most important guiding principle throughout your life or your career?
Yeah, so books, I have a weak spot for books. Like I keep every book I've ever read. I can't turn a book down. So I love some of my favorite authors. I don't even want to tell you, I can't believe he likes that author, but Ayn Rand, great sort of thinker that was able to take philosophy, and a lot of that goes back to drive and motivation and recognition and the individual, the importance of the individual. But she took sort of a philosophy and she found a way through two books, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which is Atlas Shrugged is the one I would, if I had to recommend one to read. She found a way to tell a really interesting story using philosophy. Because philosophy isn't always like the most like awe-inspiring thing, right? It can be pretty dry. She found a way to articulate that in really compelling storylines in those two books. So Atlas Shrugged would be my one. Motivation, again, having an impact, being part of a great team, but that ability to do within those two things, to go achieve, to go obtain recognition, to have that drive. That's always been, the motivator from when I started my career to today. And I think that will always continue to be. And, again, from what I've seen this evening, I think that's a common shared trait in a room.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. With that, we end the prepared questions, and now we will open the floor for students' questions.
If you raise your hand, I'll come bring you the mic. Just state your name and what degree and what year you are.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Tohoko Tajima. I'm PhD student. So my question is, so you mentioned like it's important to like summarize the technical things to talk to non-engineer people. Like how can we practice that other than actually talking to these people?
Yeah, that's another great question. I can't tell you how many people who are engineers and scientists and brilliant, and their number one response back when I would sort of make that comment is, but I don't enjoy, I'm not a natural writer. I'm not a natural presenter. I'm not a good speaker. No one is born a natural writer. No one, wakes up, starts walking and says, give me a microphone, right? Very, very, very few. It's just over and over. It's almost like learning software or learning a language. You can read about it and you can hear it, but until you dive into it with trial and error and going through the hits and misses, it's just repetition. Every opportunity you have to articulate what you're trying to say in writing, spoken, again, different formats and media formats, you will inherently get better at it. And that learning curve will be very steep. It'll be very steep and very quick. And before you know it, you're going to then gain confidence too. So it's just repetition over and over.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Kemi. I'm a PhD student as well. In line with what Tohoko asked, I was thinking about what you said about skill sets, and I also thought about the fact that you have several degrees you've gone through, like law, business, and so on. So my question is, how is the oil and gas industry, or CNX, for example, preparing for rapid advances in automation, and how can we, as upcoming professionals, prepare ourselves for that?
Awesome questions from the PhDs. Like this is great. So this is actually an area that I've been worrying about increasingly over the past year, 18 months. AI, different types of technologies that are coming down the pike. We have a little bit of a history in the energy space of things that we knew were out there, opportunities, potential, but we wrote them off. Shale gas is a huge example of that. We just wrote them off because at the time they weren't economic. At the time there wasn't an obvious, easy answer or solution to solving that. And those benefits, yeah, they eventually accrued, right? We saw the shale revolution, but it took decades. In hindsight, everybody looked at that and said, how do we miss that 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Why did it take us so long? Because there's just this inherent human nature aspect to our industry and to engineers that, everything that's been discoverable has been discovered. Now you put on top of that all these technologies that you've mentioned or you've alluded to coming from different industries that have nothing to do with energy per se, but have just immediate straight on applications. I don't know what that means moving forward. And that sort of makes me unsettled. I haven't got my head wrapped around that just yet. But what I see is, for the first time, massive technological step change advancements that are coming from areas completely away from the the energy space that are going to have major impacts, and I think positive ones for the most part, but major impacts on the energy industry itself. Mostly historically, it's always been that incremental innovation within the industry that's brought us to the next point, right? But now, what happened when we struggled with that, in terms of the accelerated application of it, what happens when we've got these things coming from completely different directions from what we're used to? I don't know the answer to that one.
Writing on Kemi's question, JP Montero, senior.
JP?
I was just wondering, should the engineers of the future also adopt these new technologies as they're trying to progress their careers at an early point or once they're in industry? What is your insight into what the engineer of the future should have?
I think at a minimum, every engineer, every STEM graduate should have, at least the front end of their career, an opportunity where you're able to immerse yourself in a very sort of technical, engineering-focused aspect of whatever industry you're working within. You don't have to cover every single link in the development chain. You don't have to spend 20 years in that arena, but having that time spent where the value is created and the risk is managed, and really immersing into the technical nuances of that specific piece, that gives you what that does is it gives you an appreciation when you progress in your career. And now you're managing or maybe directing all kinds of different sort of links in the development chain, some of which you've never worked a day within. It gives you the proper and healthy appreciation and respect for making sure that you've built a team where that expertise exists on the team, and you recognize it and defer to it where appropriate. So I think that balance of immerse on a very nuanced, detailed, specific area, get an appreciation for where your value is created and the risk is managed within your industry or your company, and then don't forget that. And when you're getting on to bigger and better and larger things that you're managing, and you don't have that expertise across everything that you're responsible for, you're ensuring that you're building a team where that is somewhere on that team.
Hi, my name is Corinne. I'm a master's student in petroleum engineering. I have two questions. First question, you mentioned a meritocracy system at CNX. Could you tell us more how does that meritocracy system work? Second question, what is the kind of person you like working with?
Oh, the type of person I like working. Well, I got Brian back there. He might have a different answer of what I like, the type of person I like working with versus what I'd say. No, the type of person I like working with is someone that is very transparent with respect to what they're thinking, where they might see the opportunity, where they might be struggling or disagreeing. To me, I think ideally when teams make decisions, using the values of responsibility, ownership, and excellence that we apply, transparent discussion is a must. Call it debate even. And ideally, you'd want consensus where we all get, like if there's 5 of us that are going to make the decision, we all get to the same point through that discussion. You have consensus. You feel really good about the decision at that point. But even if you don't have consensus, and typically you don't, right? You're not going to have a 5-0 unanimous view on things. You at least, when you're making that decision or you're that tiebreaker, you're at least doing that with the knowledge that you basically have incorporated the different thoughts and viewpoints before you go about that decision. And that'll help you not just make the better initial decision, but it will help you be ready to adjust if indeed, right, you made the wrong turn and you're going to be on the lookout for the things that were probably identified in the dissenting voice or voices. But if people are not transparent, and sometimes you'll find people that they might be vocal, but they're not being transparent, right? They're just saying what they think you want them to hear. And you're going to have to be on the lookout for that, right? You will find people on your teams alongside you. That's a blind spot. When you get into positions of influence, there will be people that will try always to tell you what they think you want to hear. That's not, in my opinion, good culture, okay? So it's not always pleasant with the type of person I like to work with, but I feel it's the best result and the best performance overall. If that makes any sense.
Awesome. Well, we've had an excellent conversation today. So, Mr. Deiuliis, if I can ask you to close us out with 2 or 3 main takeaways, came all the way here from Pittsburgh. What do you want to reemphasize to our students here as some closing remarks?
One, the talent level and potential in this room. Okay, I know you guys think highly of yourself or yourselves, but you're already underestimating what your impact can be. So that's very exciting for me, right? That gives me like great sort of interest, excitement about the future of an industry I care greatly about. 2, the legacy that you've got to live up to. Like you're getting into a great industry where you got a lot of responsibilities you're gonna have to live up to. Think about the legacy that you're coming from. I don't want to freak you out, right? But Texas A&M and the legacy, I think of 2 people in particular, General James Rudder, who I'm sort of a history buff, like that's a lot of the books I read too. Basically, he was a general in World War II who was an A&M grad in the early 30s. And he basically led an assault on D-Day on Pointe du Hoc, which was like the key place in Normandy that had been taken, and it's scaling up, 300-foot cliffs. Nobody thought it was possible. He was the leader that got that done at great risk. He also eventually became the president of Texas A&M, and he presided over that role in the late 50s. He basically grew this place into what it was. That's TAMU-SPE, okay? Again, like I don't know how to define it, but I see it right there. 2, of course, is George Mitchell. I mean, that individual, okay, has done more to transform the world in a positive way than just about anybody that I can think of. So again, he took on a lot of risk. He graduated, I guess, a little later, a little after Rudder did, and maybe right around the start of World War II. But what he did in terms of transforming the energy landscape, which again, because of the nature of energy, transformed the world, to this day, they should be building, he should have his name on more buildings and there should be more statues of him beyond College Station. I'll say that much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. On behalf of TAMU-SPE, we would like to thank you and Brian for coming just to have this very pleasant and very fruitful talk with all of our engineers and geologists here. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. And as a thank you, we would like to give you a small gift.
Great. Thank you, guys. You didn't have to.
We'll take a picture together and then we'll take a picture with all of the attendees.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.